Welcome everyone to Institutional Psychotherapy, Legacy and Constellation of Francesc Toscayes. We're excited to be together for what promises to be a rich series of discussions and conversations. A quick note that closed captioning in English is available today by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. All the conversations are translated live in American Sign Language. I'm Mathilde Walker-Bio, Curator of Programming at the American Folk Art Museum, and I'm joining you today from Queens, New York. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that our museum stands upon Lenape-Hawkins, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape-Delaware peoples. We honor Lenape peoples past, present, and future, and are committed to centering indigenous perspectives in exhibitions and programs at the museum. As many of you know, EFAM is dedicated to the work of self-taught artists across time and place, and we're thrilled to offer a new perspective on the intersections of art and psychiatry with the exhibition Francesc Toscayes, Avant-Garde Psychiatry and the Birth of Art Brut. Now on view at 2 Lincoln Square until August 18th, along with a concurrent exhibition Somewhere to Roost. Next slide. The exhibition explores for the first time in the United States the legacy of Francesc Toscayes, a Catalan psychiatrist who pioneered radical psychiatric practices that came to be known as institutional psychotherapy. So the image shows here an installation view of the exhibition. It's a gallery space with black walls and vitrines displaying a variety of materials, including archival documents, paintings, needleworks, a film projection, and a wood sculpture. The exhibition introduces us to Toscayes' time at the Saint-Alban Psychiatric Hospital in southern France from 1940 to the early 60s. It presents a complex and rich history of this institution as a refuge for political dissidents, artists, intellectuals during World War II, as an asylum village where patients, medical staff, on-site workers, and rural communities interacted in a non-hierarchical way until the early 60s, and as a creative environment for patients such as Auguste Forestier and Marguerite Sirvin, whose artistic endeavors impacted the artist Jean Dubuffet and his conceptualization of art brut in the post-war period. So in light of this rich legacy, the exhibition also examines the history of mental health and institutionalization in the United States through the work of American artists such as Martin Ramirez and Judith Scott. Next slide. So as you can note in this schedule, the Symposium Institutional Psychotherapy, Legacy and Constellation of Francesc Toscayes feature 2 conversations and 4 panel discussions taking place today and tomorrow. Today's program, entitled Institutional Psychotherapy, an intertwined history of psychiatry and politics, will focus on the ways in which Toscayes' social, political experience and thinking contribute to the development of institutional psychotherapy and resonate with the search for disability justice in the United States. And tomorrow's program, entitled Institutional Psychotherapy, an intertwined history of psychiatry and culture, will put into perspective the artistic and intellectual life at the Saint-Alban Hospital and the legacy of institutional psychotherapy in Western arts and humanities. Closing remarks by W.J.T. Mitchell and Hannah Zivin will address mental illness and its representation from a critical and historical perspective. So today we'll begin the day, the first day of our symposium, with a keynote address by exhibition co-creators Joanna Masso and Carles Guerra. Following this keynote, there will be a 30-minute break, and then we'll resume the program at 1 p.m. with our first panel, Saint-Alban-sur-Limagnole, Psychiatric Hospital, a laboratory of political resistance, with Camille Hopsis, Eric Fassin, Jean Calfa, Robert Young. It's introduced and moderated by Lewis Gordon. And the following panel, there will be a 30-minute break. And then we'll resume at 3:30 with panel 2, from desalienating to decarcerating mental illness in the United States, featuring Martin Summers, The Green Clinic, Fontaine House, Liat Ben Moshe. This last panel of the day will be introduced and moderated by one of the exhibition co-curators, Edward Giogardi. And please do submit your question in the Q&A feature as there will be time for questions at the end of each session, and we'll make every effort to get to as many as possible. I'll be using the chat room to share more details about the program, the speakers, and please note that the speakers may reference terms that were commonly used by the historical language that is not currently used to address mental illness. So throughout the talks, we will contextualize and unpack this language. And in case you have any questions, remarks about terminology, please feel free to share your thoughts in the chat. We're here to listen, learn, and provide more nuanced information about these historically charged issues. And today's program is being recorded and will be made available online with closed captioning and ASL interpretation in the coming weeks. We wish to thank the Institute Herman Lul, Nina Beatty, Susan Weiler, and the Anthony Petullo Foundation for their generous support of this symposium and making this 2 days of scholarship possible. And I hope you'll consider supporting our programs through a donation, because your support has a great impact and makes a difference in our ability to champion the work of folk and self-taught artists. And now on the next slide, with the schedule of this first session, it's my great pleasure to invite the exhibition co-curators, Joanna Masso and Carles Guerra, to kick us off with a keynote address entitled Unearthing Toscaires, the research that brought up a figure semi-buried in history. In this opening session, our speaker will share the story of their complex and multi-layered research on the figure of Toscaires, a long-term endeavor that has involved several countries, institutions, archives, and individuals. Joanna Masso is a literary critic, a senior lecturer, and a researcher at the Research Center for Theory, Gender, and Sexuality, and the UNESCO Chairwoman Development and Cultures at the University of Barcelona in Spain. Carles Guerra, an artist, art critic, and independent curator, associate professor at the Department of Audiovisual Communication at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, Spain. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you again. And please welcome our presenters. I'll be back at the end for the Q&A session. Thank you again.
Thank you for this presentation, Mathilde. Good morning, good evening. I would like to begin by welcoming you all and by saying that we are, with Carles, very, very happy to have the chance to discuss the Toscaires legacy today in New York in the context of this amazing Toscaires exhibition at the American Paul Carr Museum. Many, many thanks to Valérie Rousseau and Edward Giogardi for the incredible work, as well as to the whole team at the museum. I would like to thank first and foremost the Foundation Mir Puig in Barcelona, which supported this project at the very beginning of this research in 2017, when Carles had the amazing idea to organize a Toscaires exhibition at the Tapias Foundation in Barcelona. We are very grateful to the CCCB, the Center for the Contemporary Culture in Barcelona, which has coordinated the different presentations of the Toscaires show. That was a considerable amount of work requiring special attention for each presentation with different teams in different countries. So we are very, very grateful to the CCCB, and we are deeply grateful to the Institute Ramon Llull in Catalonia, which has made this exhibition possible, as well as our symposium today and the film program to be held during the month of June in collaboration with the Museum of the Moving Image in New York. We were very lucky to be able to present the Toscaires exhibition before New York in the 3 countries where Toscaires himself lived, first in France at the Museum Les Abattoirs de Toulouse, where we focused on Tusquellas' condition as a Catalan Republican exiled in France, and his experience of living and working in a concentration camp in southern France in the fall of 1939 during the Nazi occupation, where he organized a therapeutic unit within the camp. We also presented the show in Barcelona at the CCCB, where the exhibition focused on Tusquellas' relationship with Catalonia during the 30s, with clinical experiments that he had carried out, such as with autistic children, while the anarchists were in power in the Catalan government, and his experiments during the Catalan Republic during the 30s, which proposed a new network of mental health care services that would be decentralized and cover the entire territory. Finally, when the show was presented at the Museum Reina Sofia in Madrid last year, we had the extraordinary opportunity to bring together Tusquellas films, historical photographs, and clinical material with the museum's art collection itself. When we began with Carles this research on Tusquellas in Barcelona 7 years ago, we soon realized that Tusquellas' history was not part of the history of the victors of the Spanish Civil War. It was not, of course, part of the Francoist narrative of the 20th century in Spain. The Franco dictatorship lasted for 4 decades, but neither was it part of the history of the vanquished. In other words, Tusquellas' history had not been told by the Republic and the progressive political movements in Spain. So Tusquellas was not a forgotten history in a certain way. It was rather a history not yet told, because historians of the 1930s Republic and the Spanish Civil War didn't mention Tusquellas' transformation of psychiatric institutions. So we had this responsibility to recount, to narrate today the emancipatory experiences that the vanquished of the 20th century in Catalonia did not have the time to write. This was, of course, a sort of last victory of the dictatorship itself, the absence of emancipatory psychiatry, the absence of emancipatory past in the 20th century psychiatry in Catalonia and in Spain in the main narratives. Moreover, at the beginning of our research, we realized that there were hardly any of Tusquellas' texts translated or available to read either in Spanish or in Catalan, and a number of his essays were out of print also in French. That's why, in addition to a catalog with critical contemporary text to accompany the Tusquellas exhibition, I also wanted to write a book that included an important anthology of essays written by Tusquellas himself. My book, Tusquellas, Curing the Institutions, has been published in different languages, in French, in Catalan, and Spanish, and very soon it will be published in other languages like English next year by Semiotext in Los Angeles and Divided Publishing in London. The question of providing access to Tusquellas' texts was a very important one, because we were in the process of bringing Tusquellas into the world of culture and art, but we also had to provide access to his own writings with an important selection of texts and interviews written from the 30s to the 90s. He died in 94. Last year, Tusquellas' portfolio has been published by the Los Angeles Review of Books by Perwana Nazif, and this year 2 journals will publish issues on Tusquellas in English: the journal French Politics, Culture and Society, thanks to Gabriel Quickly, and the journal Parapraxis, thanks to Hannah Zivin and Perwana Nazif. So many thanks to all of you, Perwana, Gabriel, and Hannah. In addition to the Tuskegee exhibitions and the different publications which presented very important documents and historical archives, it was very important for me to be able to talk about a number of experiments in which Tuskegee had participated, but which had not left historical traces, no archives. I am thinking in particular of his famous and somewhat mythical collaboration with sex workers during the Spanish Civil War in the context of a therapeutic community in which these women became nurses, as well as the famous and also very mythical letter Tuskegee sent to the communist dictator Joseph Stalin at the end of the 20s, both as a denunciation of Stalinism and an affirmation of local minoritarian revolutionary politics in Catalonia. It was so important for me to talk about these experiences, which couldn't be proven, but that were part of Tusquede's clinical and political experimentations. This is how we began to work with Catalan artist Mireia Sallarès on our film entitled Potential History of Francesc Tusquelles, Catalonia and Fear. The film departed from this idea that a past of Tusquelles existed that did not make it into history, and we were inspired by Ariela Azoulai's work, professor of modern culture and media at Brown University, and her conception of potential history as historical experiences that have really existed, but that we cannot prove with documents. When we began this research, we realized that the archival work was has above all made this research possible because it was the archives that revealed the silences of this history. Yet the question of the archives was a difficult one, not only because there is no main centralized archive center on Tuskegee, but rather disseminated repositories and polls. The Tuskegee archives are dispersed in different countries and institutions, in Catalonia, in Spain, in France, in Switzerland, in Belgium, in psychiatric hospitals, in medical libraries, in political correspondence or artistic institutions, in museums. So the question of the archive was also a complex one, because in a certain way, we were deciding as the researchers of this project and the creators of this exhibition, what documents and what letters and what works of art would now constitute the Tuskegee archive within the exhibition. In a way, the Tuskegee exhibition is the real archive now, since once the show ends, all the materials will be again dispersed in multiple places. Moreover, what was interesting for us is that Tuskegee multiplied the archives of his own work in his different psychiatric institutions. Tuskegee was one of the first psychiatrists to make films at the beginning of the 50s to document collective life in the hospital. He documented the experience of the theater with patients, the balls at the hospital, as well as the experience of reorganizing the buildings of the hospital. Far from being addressed to the scientific community, these films were first viewed by the patients themselves and the therapeutic community at the hospital as a therapeutic tool. So all these films were a way of producing a reflecting image, a reflexive way of documenting these real institutions and associations that managed to change the life within the asylums. I would like to conclude this first intervention by commenting one of the most striking pictures that Tusquellas wanted to took of himself, always as a way of producing an archive of his own practice and his own engagement at the hospital. As you can see in the picture, I think, Carlas, that you showed the picture before, the picture when we
should ask,
with the tongue.
Should ask Richard to move to the next slide.
Yes, maybe.
Next one, please. Yeah.
So in this picture, you can see Tusquellas in front of the camera, dressed in a white coat. So he stuck out his tongue, as we have done since childhood when we go to the doctor because we are ill. So Tusquellas literally represented himself in a way as a psychiatrist in the position of the ill person, or in other words, he represented the psychiatrist as a mad figure, so as to say that psychiatrists should heal their disease, since Tusquellas thought that psychiatrists were profoundly afraid of the mentally ill patients, which historically led to impeding patients' freedom of movement through restrained chairs and beds, straitjackets, and seclusion rooms. He thus thought that psychiatrists should cure this fear of madness and their fear of patients' suffering. During the 50s in Saint-Alban, Tusquellas removed the window bars and the balcony barracks of the hospital. He opened the hospital so as the patients could interact with the villagers and the farmers, and he advocated for patients' right to roam, the right to vagrancy. Moreover, Tusquellas' idea was that people who haven't been trained as psychiatrists haven't yet developed such fear of madness. That's the reason why he worked with people outside the medical profession. He was very happy collaborating with musicians, with writers and lawyers, and even nuns or sex workers. I do think that we still have a psychiatry which fears madness, and more generally, a medicine which fears illness and suffering in general, trying to put them at a distance. So the Tusquellas legacy based on socializing and depathologizing madness is still ours, and we still need it. Instead of directly curing the patients themselves, Tusquellas resolved to treat the medical community. He cured the normal pathologies of doctors and nurses faced to patients, the suffering and the anxieties of normal people rather than the patients themselves. Thank you.
Please, Richard, next slide. Hi, everyone there on the other side. I also want to begin by saying few thank you notes. And the first one, I would like to go to Valérie Rousseau and to Eddie Dioguardi for leading this adaptation to the American Folk Art Museum, which is a brilliant conclusion of these four instances, these four itinerary exhibition, which started, as Joanna was saying, in Toulouse, then Barcelona, Madrid, and finally New York. I really want to thank you, Valérie Rousseau, because she's been there all the time, right from the beginning when we started research, and she immediately saw the potential of this project, but not just as a local project, but a project that should go internationally. I also want to thank you, the staff of the museum at the American Folk Art Museum, for their committed enthusiasm in presenting this exhibition. And of course, Matilde Walker-Villot for organizing this symposium, which is a great gift to the memoir of Francesc Tosquelles. And last but not least, the Institut Ramon Llull and the Center for Contemporary Culture in Barcelona, who have been supporting this project all throughout different places and different moments. The slide I chose to start my brief note here on this first chapter, which should be dealing with the very basic process of research, It is a snapshot taken in Plaça Catalunya in Barcelona by 2011, in the first months of that year, when a multitude gathered, following the example of the Tahrir Square demonstrations, and later on follow as well by Plaza del Sol or the Occupy Wall Street in New York. This was really the first time ever I came across the name of Tosquelles, and it was among a group of young friends, who were dedicating to be doing schizoanalysis in the public space. And their reference was Tosquelles. Of course, for me, it was an completely unknown reference or name. But soon after, I came across the work that Maurizio Lazzarato and Angela Melitopoulos have completed, Déconnage, a brilliant frieze of about 100 minutes, based on a recording that took place in Tosquelles' house back in 1987, which was conducted, an interview, a conversation, which was conducted by Daniel Sivadon, Jean-Claude Pollack, and filmed by François Pen and Marion Shemama. This long recording, which took several days to be completed, it was a brilliant occasion for Tosquelles to recapitulate his own life. It was there that he explained experiences, as Joanna was saying, that we will soon try to find the factual evidence. Of course, Tosquelles describes the transition from his birthplace, Reus, in the late 20s, the Catalan, the moment of the Spanish Republic in the 30s, through the Spanish Civil War, the concentration camp in 1940, and then his arrival at Saint-Alban-sur-Limagnol, the little village in the center of France. And there he stops his story. The question is that Tosquelles was composing a narrative of his life, and as he said at the very beginning of the recording, he was very much aware that when one starts to tell his or her own story, you very likely will end up being a hero or a zero, as he said. So this is a base material, kind of a template for the research we conducted. And in consequence, it's been part of the 3 exhibitions, at least in Toulouse, Barcelona, and Madrid. Of course, the research had to really delve and dig up in factual history and try to find the text, as Joanna was suggesting, and also the historical coordinates in which these men acted in the past. Astonishingly, most of the episodes Tosquelles was telling through his own speech and narrative were completely ignored in the recent history of Spain and even Catalonia. Not so much in France, since he was quite a well-known representative figure of institutional psychotherapy there. But yes, in Catalonia and in Spain, basically his innovations were completely obliterated. And even though he was part of a renovation of a movement that renovated psychiatry along political action and cultural intervention, their contributions were completely lost. And Tosquelles was not the only one. I mean, he belonged to a generation in which other psychiatrists like Josep Solanes, Joaquim Allier, Josep Sauret, Jaume Sauret, were part of it. So it was a generation that understood clinical practice as a practice intrinsically connected to political action and cultural practices as well. So this revealed the complexity of the project right from the start. What provoked that the sort of materials that we will end up dealing with were very variegated, heterogeneous, not only coming from multiple sources, but also in terms of objecthood, having very different qualities. namely medical reports, materials, related to cultural productions, like work related to surrealism, and also political positions, ideas, ideologies that were transferred through periodicals, through different media. The fact is that it was a research that we considered necessary to restitute our own history. As I said, not so much in France. That's why we insisted on the idea to restitute also the Catalan name of Tosquelles to Francesc, even though he naturalized himself and his family in 1947 in France. But the idea was to fill a gap in our history, and this gap was revealed exactly at this moment. At this moment, you see in the slide, when there is a crisis in the forms of governmentality, there is a crisis in our beliefs, in our sort of expectations towards institutions. There emerges the name of Francesc Tosquelles, someone who was able, with his apparently limited practice within the psychiatric institution, to bring forth revolutionary ideas. So the interesting aspect of this research is that we ended up composing an exhibition with so diverse material that it was very difficult to make sense of it all together in one single gallery, in one single museum. But this was the challenge, and this was what revealed the necessity to reconsider the objecthood, the quality of the objects that made part of this history. So we ended up showing along together works of so-called art brut with the films of Tosquelles, which I would contend and not say that they document, but rather that they really expand the birth transfer. That is to say, it is a filming of the activities inside of the hospital, that it's not for the sake of documenting, but for the sake of expanding the connections, the constellation of relationships among caregivers, doctors, villagers, and the patients. So the film has a very specific quality which goes beyond documentation and should be treated as something that actually helps and contributes and becomes part of the therapeutic dispositive. The same goes for the journals that were published inside of the hospital, namely Trait d'Union, hyphen, which means connection, or also for all the activities of the patients' clubs that propose moments of gathering, moments in which this birth transfer, this moment of sort of birth transfer, it's quite a complex term, but I guess Camille Robsys will make it more clear later on in his intervention. Yet birth transfer is what really marks a clear innovation in terms of therapeutical treatments inside of this hospital in Saint-Alban, meaning by that a situation by which there is not a one-to-one relationship between doctors and patients, but a network of relationships which constitute the real associations, the real links that will become the cure. So I would like to close this chapter by saying that the exhibition itself would not constitute a permanent archive, but rather a sort of, a reivindication of a different quality in objects, having the possibility to have a medical report next to a painting or an object produced by a patient in the hospital is the possibility also to reinvent social relationships, to promote a different sociality, which is one of the goals in those institutions that Francesc Tosquelles worked. And I give the floor to Joana now.
Thank you, Carlos. So our research on Tusquellas has led us, as you see, has led us not only to have now a better understanding of Tusquellas' transformative and very situated work at the hospital, but also that has led us to rethink his emancipatory practices in relationship to other 20th century avant-gardes. Carlos and I would like now to explore in our in this chapter, in our presentations, a number of these avant-garde movements that Tusquellas' critical legacy enables us to rethink today or to rewrite in a certain way. On my end, I would like to focus on Tusquellas' way of recognizing women's work at the hospital, from women psychiatrists to subaltern nurses, as well as Tusquellas' critique on surrealist movement during the 30s and the 40s, as well as his critique on the concept of art brut or outsider art. We know today that the Saint-Alban Hospital was one of the places where, as Carlos said, from the 30s to the 60s, experimental practices were developed that were at once political, psychiatric, and artistic. In the past, this history has usually been told as a legendary narrative according to which some individuals, some men, cured the psychiatric asylum. Men like communist doctors, like Lucien Bonafé, resistors like a surrealist poet Paul Éluard, French philosophers like Félix Guattari and Frantz Fanon, both psychiatrists, artists also like Jean Dubuffet, who lived, who worked, or who visited the hospital at Saint-Alban. Yet the presence of these important figures in the French landscape has often obscured, on the one hand, the hospital as a space for collective life and care, and on the other hand, the work of women. In our exhibition and in our research with Carlos, we really wanted to explore the legacy of women whose role in the transmission of institutional psychotherapy has been overlooked in the past. Psychiatrists such as Agnès Masson and Germaine Balvet, as well as nuns who were progressively recognized as caregivers during the 40s. Upon his arrival at Saint-Alban in 1940, Tusquellas inherited the reorganization of the hospital by psychiatrist Agnès Masson, the doctor who was appointed as head of the establishment during the 30s. Agnès Masson arrived in La Lozère as the first woman director of a French psychiatric public hospital. Her project at Saint-Alban was the modernization, the running water, the electrical installation, the central heating, the ending use of the straitjacket, the organization of a library and cinema with patients. She also organized new pavilions, a sewer network, and a laundry room, and also a laboratory construction project. Among the psychiatric team in Saint-Alban, Tusquellas was the only one who transmitted Agnès Masson's legacy, since he recounted that Masson was the first who, at the hospital, removed the straitjackets, and she invented what Tusquellas and Bonafé called the geopsychiatry, understood as a migratory work in the local territory, since Agnès Masson had brought one of the yellow or black cruiser tractors from Citroën to be able to pick up the patients. This geopsychiatry was the point of departure for French sector psychiatry in the 60s, which was a critique of the hospital centrism and implied the preference for care outside of the hospital walls. Agnès Masson, of course, was not the only woman psychiatrist through whom Tusquellas inherited at Saint-Alban the transformation of psychiatric practice. This is true of other women who lived or traveled to the hospital and of whom very few traces have survived, the nuns. During the Nazi occupation of France, during a period of severe food restrictions, Tusquellas organized the first training courses in 1943 for the staff, teaching psychiatry, teaching psychology, teaching psychoanalysis, before the training of nurses was formalized and institutionalized in France a decade after, during the 50s. And this training of former custodians and sisters into nurses was at the heart of the institutional transformation of the hospital. In this context of work with non-professional teams, which went hand in hand with a form of therapeutic formal training, pioneering psychiatric and psychoanalytic training, Tusquellas met surrealist poet Paul Éluard and his wife, Nouche, during their stay at the hospital in 1943. When persecuted by the Gestapo as resistance during the Nazi occupation, Paul Éluard and Nouche went into hiding at Saint-Alban. Éluard was the one who suggested poet Gérard de Nerval's romantic writings as the clinical corpus for Tusquellas' medical dissertation, since Nerval had been hospitalized in several psychiatric clinics before his suicide in Paris in the middle of the 19th century. Tusquellas followed Éluard's advice to work on Nerval's clinical and poetic writings. Nevertheless, Tusquellas challenged in his medical thesis both surrealist and romantic misconceptions of madness. Even though one continues to narrate often today Tusquellas' emancipatory practices at Saint-Alban related to surrealism, Tusquellas formulated a critique that contested the surrealist understanding of madness. In the 1940s, when Éluard arrived to Saint-Alban, surrealist writers had already celebrated during the 20s hysteria as a supreme means of expression, and Éluard had collaborated with French writer André Breton in 1930 to explore the simulation of different mental disorders and psychopathological delusions in their texts. Surrealist writers not only sought to imitate the voices of madness in their own literary writings, but also staged the patients' cries from the Sainte-Anne Psychiatric Hospital within the International Exhibition of Surrealism at the end of the 30s in Paris. For Tusquellas, the surrealist fascination with patients' scream in surrealist exhibitions and texts reveal, rather than an interest in illness itself, an obsession with madness identified with women, with the others. Far from this fascination, Tusquellas sought for a concrete singularity of experience in psychic suffering that was missing in surrealism. He criticized French surrealists for not being able to take a real interest, as he said, in the existential facts of madness, since Tusquellas' aim was to really take into account what he called the lived experience, le vécu of madness by patients. Tusquellas really wanted to imagine how the whole psychiatry could be reinvented by really acknowledging patients' concrete lived experience of suffering. And the reading of this concrete singularity of psychic suffering was the very project of Tusquellas' medical dissertation. He studied Nerval, the Romantic poet, both as a way of giving value to this testimony, his testimony of his suffering, and a critique to the surrealist vindication of Nerval. Tusquellas also devoted a collective conception of psychiatry that recognized patients' capacity to play a role in the process of their own cure and that of others. This multi-person psychotherapy, he said, was something he found in the text entitled Aurelia, a story that the poet Gérard de Nerval left unfinished upon his suicide after his confinement to several mental institutions. In this literary text, the different patients were not treated by their psychiatrists, but by other patients, like Nerval himself. So the Tusquellas' concern was to pay attention to those whose voices have been silenced not only by psychiatric violence, but also by avant-garde movements like Surrealism, fascinated by the figure of the madman and the mad woman. For Tusquellas, madness was not, of course, about the others, but about us. It was through Surrealism, through the figure of Paul Éluard, that artist Jean Dubuffet discovered Saint-Alban, and he came to the hospital in 1945 at the very moment in which he invented the concept of art brut, or outsider art, so as to name the pieces of work produced by people not having been trained by artistic culture, namely self-taught artists. At that time, in 1945, Tusquellas refused to meet Dubuffet at the hospital. Moreover, he refused that Dubuffet encounter one of his patients at the hospital, Auguste Forestier, since Tusquellas wanted to protect him. A large number of sculptures, drawings, and embroideries created by hospital residents began to leave Saint-Alban in 1947, when the psychiatrist Jean Houry, then an intern at the hospital with Tusquellas, organized shipments at the request of the artist Jean Dubuffet, who from Paris undertook the vast project of collecting works produced in isolated context by people which he considered non-touched by culture, artistic culture. 2 decades after, in 1966, Dubuffet wrote an essay in which he referred to the oppressive seclusion in the Saint-Alban hospital that he described as, I quote him, a desert island. To speak, of course, of Saint-Alban as a desert island is a historical and a political misunderstanding between, on the one hand, Tusquellas psychiatry that wanted to repair life, and on the other hand, Dubuffet's searching for marginalized styles and anti-cultural or anti-social gestures, very far, of course, from real and collective emancipation, such as that of Saint-Alban. Today, museums and collections of art brut should begin to rewrite this history in order to move away from Dubuffet's extractive project, which today raises questions, the question of the patient's consent. Most of the time, the patients in the psychiatric hospitals didn't consent to this transformation of their own works into art through exhibitions and museums. And most of the time, they didn't receive money in exchange. They never attended the openings of the exhibitions in which their work was presented, and they were never asked about the way in which they wanted their work to be presented in museums. So today, this story raises questions about cultural appropriation or artistic appropriation, which means a form of appropriation of the culture or the art of others, most of the time the culture of a minority, without taking into account or without wanting to acknowledge the fact that this minority culture is both socially dominated, vulnerable, and clearly poor. That's the reason why the history of the outsider art or the art route can be thought today in parallel to other forms of art manufactured by African communities, Black communities, which we find inside the collections of art in the Western museums. And today we can begin to imagine different ways of repatriation of these works to their historical contexts. Thank you.
So, please, next slide. Indeed, as Joanna was saying, the hospital and the whole community of the hospital that was kind of the leading place for the institutional psychotherapy. It is a community with some celebrated names and some other names that were never acknowledged, that were never mentioned, or who never had a proper name to refer to. So indeed, not only women, but there will be a host of unnamed figures that will be emerging bit by bit, slowly from this big space that was the hospital, considering that the hospital was a sort of a machine that denies citizenship to all those patients that cross their gates. And this is a fact, a condition, an important condition that Tosquelles had to overcome himself there, being an exile, a Republican, living in a foreign country, and having to reinvent himself as a French psychiatrist. So there is here an interesting aspect in this denial of citizenship. And in my understanding, one of the important contributions or legacies of Tosquelles is indeed the club, the Patients Club, as you can see here in these posters, which are actually from the 70s, not from the period that Tosquelles was working in the hospital, because as Joanna was saying, there is little left behind in this story to sustain evidence. Yet, I mean, we have sufficient information to understand that the Patients Club not only became another therapeutical dispositive, another therapeutical sort of possibility, in as much as it gave back some sort of agency to these patients who were deprived of any form of autonomy, either financial or individual. So the Patients Club, it's a construction, or it's a dispositive. I like to say dispositive because it's a whole situation, an organization that will allow the patients to organize themselves. It is an organization very much based on the cooperativist tradition that Tosquelles lived through the 20s and the 30s in Catalonia, in the Republican period. And it is also a formula, a form of organization that we will find during the Soviet Revolution with the workers' clubs. And as it turns out, it is a form of organization that deals mostly with the organization of leisure time, free time that will be filled with a lot of activities that at the end of the day will become productive. So for Tosquelles here, there is again another interesting détournement by making the club, which is supposed to organize parties, celebrations, events, and make out of it another productive way of being in the hospital, and to make it possible for the patients to have their own economies, which they didn't have. Tosquelles is often the case. He's someone who is good at sort of determining and sort of twisting things in a way that the original idea becomes something else, something very likely revolutionary. For example, the title of the exhibition we use for Barcelona and Madrid, which is like a sewing machine in a wet field. I'm pretty sure it resonates in all of you with the Lautréamont famous saying, beautiful as the chance meeting on a dissection table of a sewing machine and an umbrella. Tosquelles said, expressed, quoted this idea in the early 70s when he was prompted about the effects of the decentralization politics in France, which was in a way following the model of the 1934 law in Catalonia. And Tosquelles was very much skeptical. He thought that that law at the end didn't really bring didn't solve the problems they were wrestling with. So by saying himself, like a sewing machine in a wet field, he simultaneously evoked Lautréamont's saying, and a phrase utter, and the whole situation that Tosquelles lived through the 30s in Catalonia, meaning taking surrealism to local spaces, to rural spaces, and making of surrealism something less of a salon game. So here we have a Tosquelles that had to really overcome critical situations, emergencies, like Félix Guattari recalls in a famous interview in 1986, when he recalls his period in Saint-Albin in the year 1956, and he presents Tosquelles as someone like a somewhat militant of survival, someone who will organize how to survive a desperate, critical, or humanitarian crisis, and someone not interested at all in a sort of narcissistic drive. So this characterization by Félix Guattari, it's very important, because often we will think that all his actions, all his ideas were determined by the many theories that plague the psychiatric practices in those years. And there are many, indeed, considering that Tosquelles was formed in the 30s under the influence of many Central European psychiatrists and psychoanalysts who were fleeing from Nazi anti-Semitic persecution in the early 30s. All those, like Alfred Strauss, Werner Wolf, Sandro Minder, ended up in Barcelona. This is what prompted him to call Barcelona in the 30s the Little Vienna. So Tosquelles was someone who was well equipped in terms of theories, but he was never dogmatic, and he always acted pragmatically. So that is one of the important legacies in my understanding, not to consider institutional psychotherapy as something translatable to other sites, spaces, places, or geographies. In fact, it is well known the report of Jacques Azoulay, the collaborator of Frantz Fanon, when Frantz Fanon went to Blida in 1954, I mean, he implemented institutional psychotherapy along the lines that he had learned by working close with Tosquelles. Very soon, they realized that those forms of implementing changes in the hospital were not the measures were not what was exactly needed in Blida. Texas Lay sort of coined the term, sort of reformulated the necessity to work along the lines of ethnopsychiatry, acknowledging the culture that sort of preceded those patients that ended up in hospitals like the one in Blida under French colonialism. So one of the legacies of Tosquelles' practice, I would like to say, is that it is utterly irreplicable. I mean, you cannot translate it. You can get inspired by it, you can learn from it, but you cannot imagine an exact replica somewhere else. This is the fact, for example, Tosquelles himself, when in 1967 went back to Reus, the hospital in which he started his medical psychiatric practices in the 30s, he also brought those three basic ideas, like the periodical as the main device, as the main medium to generate a sense of community, the continuous training of the professionals and the patients club. To be honest, out of those three ideas, only the idea of the permanent training of the doctors caregivers in Reus was a little bit successful, and it actually generated what was called like the institutional analysis group, which consisted in a massive network of sound tapes being exchanged in order to analyze the institution through the encounters and not through clinical cases. So analyzing the institution through perceptions of their own personnel. So these massive dispositifs with tapes and recordings, it is something that it has to be yet worked out and studied. But I really believe that it is in there that Tosquelles found a way to represent the network that constitutes a hospital, a psychiatric hospital. And in that sense, Tosquelles will always be someone defending the institution, the hospital, no matter how reactionary it made him look like at the moment in the mid-70s, when the anti-psychiatry movement accused him of being reactionary, precisely for keeping the idea that the hospital should be a decent place where to host these alternative forms of life. And I like to give the floor to Joanna now.
Thank you, Carles. And so we would like to address in our brief and final remarks of our presentation with Carles the question of the institutional psychotherapy in art institutions, in museums, since in Catalonia and in Spain, as well as in the States, the discovery of, or the rediscovery of Tosquelles' legacy has been made not by the scientific or medical or psychiatric field, but through the art field or through the history of culture. We might wonder by which means this forgotten Tosquelles legacy, which is still in the margins of the great narrative of the history of French psychiatry of the 20th century, managed to spread through our art museums so as to name today, in a broader sense, the institutional illness of our contemporary institutions, including cultural ones, from schools and universities to public administrations and political institutions. Contemporary art centers in recent times have begun to inherit these practices of the transformation of the institution in a cultural context, like in the current exhibition in the Art Center in Paris, Le Palais de Tokyo, with the exhibition devoted to the institutional psychotherapy entitled, in English, Approaching Unreason, Toucher l'Insensé. It is, strictly speaking, the institutional work, the critique and the transformation of the institution itself that is at the heart of the questions being raised by contemporary art centers. And they had embraced the rhetoric of participatory pedagogies, education and mediation, as well as care. By welcoming the issues of care, understood as a form of approach or treatment which is denied any value, art centers seek to take part in the construction of a new common sense on institutions, in a political sense, like in the Palais de Tokyo. Nonetheless, the deep relationships between care, real mediation, and institutional psychotherapy remained to be elaborated. Of course, this institutional work in contemporary art centers and museums will not work unless they really engage the museum as a whole, the museum as a collective. And in this sense, I would like to quote Tusquellas to conclude my remarks. He wrote during the 60s, "This collective approach therapy is an activity that involves the whole community of doctors, carers, and patients. And if the patients, whoever works at the hospital in exchange with the community of carers, do not succeed in putting something of themselves into the work they are doing, then the collective therapy has failed. It also fails if the group is not listened to, if the patient's voice is not respected, or if the therapy does not help the patient himself or herself to become his or her own carer by way of the effort they put into the work, he or she puts into the work." End of the quote. Of course, it goes without saying that the museum cannot be the only place to inherit the legacy of the institutional psychotherapy, and we hope that a true transmission of this legacy will soon find new forms in care institutions or to be invented, as well as in public and political institutions. That's the reason why I would like to conclude by welcoming a recent project that an initiative that is to some extent the result of also of our research work on Tusquellas, which is the creation of a cultural center in Saint-Alban, inside the Saint-Alban Hospital in France, La Lozère, which will take care of the historical archives of the hospital. So let's hope it can become very soon, next year maybe, a space for research, for researchers, so that this history can continue to be transmitted. Many, many thanks.
Thank you, Joanna. Please, can we have the next slide too? Yes, indeed. What we want to address here in this final remark is the very evidence that institutional psychotherapy is becoming sort of a subject for new museums programs, and something that interpolates the actual conditions of most museums. And this makes sense in a moment when we imagine ever more inclusive institutions, but it is also a moment when the museum can be considered a civic laboratory that nevertheless it's treating us as raw material. That is to say, the museum has become a place for a new form of sociality and as well for a new form of productivity. So here, what we risk is to see all this work around institutional psychotherapy or about Tusquellas and his individual figure as a strategy of monumentalizing, mythologizing an individual experience, which I wouldn't like that to happen. On the contrary, I think the efforts have to be directed towards reworking the network that made it possible that someone like Tusquellas existed. And as I said, Tusquellas is not just the only name, the only figure. There is a host of other names, and it would be important to reconstruct dialogically how institutional psychotherapy emerged. To begin with, the first reference to institutional psychotherapy, psychothérapie institutionnelle, was published in a Portuguese review, Anais Portuguesas de Psiquiatria, and then transported to France. So institutional psychotherapy, it is interesting in as much as it is an open-ended set of relationships between individuals, material conditions of life, and places. That's why I chose this slide of the all women's ward in Sant Alban to represent the present day condition of institutional psychotherapy. This is the way it still looks the psychiatric hospital in Sant Alban a few years ago when we visited it with Joanna, Alejandra Riera, myself, and other colleagues. And I think that we have to really prevent this sort of essentializing, monumentalizing, and mythologizing, and be able to extract from institutional psychotherapy the very revolutionary aspect, which is the fact that it dilutes individualities and it really pays attention to collectives. I would like to finish with an invitation to see the exhibition, because it is really an exhibition, the one in New York, that succeeds in bringing bringing to the foreground a sense of material life in Sant Alban, thanks to many objects from the so wrongly called art brut by Forestier, Marguerite Sirvens, Benjamin Arneval. One can really sense the material conditions that sort of existed at that moment in that period, which is often called a period of extreme invention, yet the material conditions were really precarious. Thank you very much, and we are open to your questions.
Thank you so much for this presentation, Joanna and Carles, and it was a great dive into the different and a great way to start the day and the symposium and to learn more about Toscaïès and also the connection he has with different aspects of the history of psychiatry and also the arts. I don't see any question yet. Please share your question. Maybe as we start, I can kick off the Q&A with a few questions for you, Joanna and Carles. I would love to talk about the way in which you work together as a team. As you could see, this symposium was conceived as an interdisciplinary program, international program, and I think that's really you are team and also a curator, and Joanna as a philologist and a translator. So I would love for you to maybe bring into the discussion and what did that bring to your understanding of Toscaïès and how the collaboration unfolded.
Do you want to start, Carles?
Yeah, I will go. Yes, indeed. For me, it was a bit of a challenge, this project. And, you know, the first time I presented back in 2012, the video installation by Angela Militopoulos and Maurizio Lazzarato at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Barcelona, I was prompted by someone topping the museum, and she basically interpellated me and asked me, what are we doing with the psychiatrists in the museum? And I was completely shocked. I didn't know how to respond at that particular moment, but I realized how challenging was the operation to bring that discourse into a museum of contemporary art, which, by the way, had already presented other politically oriented projects. And it was not the first one, but this one was characterized by the praxis of psychiatry. So it took me years to actually come to terms with that, but I basically realized what it meant when I was confronted with the sheer diversity of materials and had to really edit it all together to make sense in order to explain the history of Toscaïès himself and institutional psychotherapy. It is that new sense of objecthood that emerges out of that amount of materials. And when I say different, they are they're utterly different, like medical reports, political tracks, films of all kinds, which I insist on saying. I would like to avoid the word documentation, because I think we are not really getting the very transformative function of those films if we call them documents. They are really an extension of these constellation, and through that extension, the film becomes a therapeutical dispositive. So for me, this was a massive challenge, and I think that every now and then you discover new ways of understanding objecthood, and this is the joy about working in museums. And this joy can go back, for example, to that experience I was telling you before, which is the fact that, in the exhibition at the American Folk Art Museum, the objects transmit something of the material life that these people lived through in those particular moments.
My notes.
Yeah. Thank you, Mathilde, for this question. I think that your question is a very important one, and I think that you are right to say that Carles he comes from the artistic world. He's an artist. He has been director in different art institutions, in different museums, universities. I am coming from, I am an academic, I do research at the university, I teach at the university. And of course, Carles too teaches at the university, but he has another background. And I think that your question is a very important one, because it's not that evident that, as Carles says, that we could find the legacy of Tusquellas in a museum, in an art center. And of course, this collaboration between Carles and myself, as well as other projects like you may know Fernand de Ligny in France. Also, the question on Fernand de Ligny in France, the educator and writer Fernand de Ligny, was why the work of Fernand de Ligny should be seen in art institutions or art museums. So the question of art is not evident, is not transparent in order to rediscover the Tusquellas legacy. Of course, if other people coming from other backgrounds different from ours had done this research, maybe Tusquellas will not be now in an art institutions. Maybe he will be only in a new history of psychiatry in Catalonia or in Spain. So I do think that the fact that we were working through different fields, and of course the question of the translation, as you put it, Matilda, was an important one, because we had to translate different Tusquellas texts. We had also to, in a certain way, to culturally translate some concepts in order to make sense of them. So the question of the art or the art forms is an important one. It was not that evident. For example, Carles, I don't know what do you think in this at the exhibition, the show at the CCCB. For the first time, we show a very long series of psychopathological art. Of course, the paintings from the psychopathological art were not paintings in which Tusquellas were in discussion or in dialogue. With Carles, we've decided that to put these artworks in the exhibition could make easy for us to make the point of the art brut. So we decided a lot of different entries, different strategies to make Tusquellas today intelligible or something like that. Even in a political way, of course, Carles started talking on Plaza Catalunya in Barcelona, and the El 15M manifestations and demonstrations and so on. And of course, our discovery of Tusquelles was also related to the independence referendum also in Catalonia. So you have all different entries, but for me, the very question that you are trying to put, Matilde, and a very important one is, what are we doing with this Tusquelles legacy through the art world? And the question of this question is also raised in Le Palais de Tokyo in Paris nowadays, and it's for me a still open question.
Thank you so much to both of you for these answers, and expansion on my questions. And I think you also touched upon another topic that is raised in the chat about the fact that Tusquelles is so little known, and still today. So the question from Edward Carber is, to what do you attribute America's lack of awareness of Tusquelles' work? And I think we could expand on that and say it's not only in the United States, it's also in Europe, in France, and in Spain. So if you can expand on that different aspect of the knowledge the little knowledge we still have on him, and the fact you had to recover this figure.
Do you want to start, Carlos, or
Oh,
do you want
go ahead. Go ahead.
I am not really sure, Matilde, if I did really understand your question. You were asking us to develop more about the
lack
new
of recognition.
contents.
Yes, so the question from our audience is, to what do you attribute America's lack of awareness of Tusquelles' work?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say it's not only here in the US, but also across Europe.
I saw I said something at the beginning of my presentation, the idea that Tusquelles was a story that was not still told by the vanquished of the 20th century during the Spanish Civil War in Spain. So it was a sort of memory not yet told, not yet elaborated. But of course, Carlos was focusing on the question of the collective. For me, this is an important point, because the collective experiences, the real collective experiences in the 20th century have been very little transmitted. Most of the times you have in the Surrealist movement, in the Dadaist movement, in the Cubist movement, and so on and so on, and in art brut, field, and so on, you have usually you have big names, important names. So if we wanted to transmit this collective, experience as a collective narrative, that was more and more difficult. And for us, the space of the museum or the art center was very interesting, because in a museum, as Carla said, you can put a paper or a photocopy next to a Dali painting or something like that, as we done in the exhibition, not in New York, but in Barcelona and in Madrid. So the idea of these different kind of juxtapositions of materials was very interesting in the exhibition. Also, in my book, I Curing the Institutions, Tusquelles Curing the Institutions, I've tried to imagine a form, a non-linear form, or non only a narrative form, because you have photograms, you have stills from the movies, you have pictures, you have letters, you have documents. So the idea more of sort of a box of archives or something like that. So we were trying to find forms in which this collective story should be transmitted as collective, not just as an addition of different individuals, as it has been done before us.
Yeah, I just would like to add to the wonderful remark that Joanna has just said. the fact that Tosquelles is also a fascinating figure because he embodies a connection among the ultra-local experiences and something that can be rather transversal. And I think this is what proves his capacity to be the one individual who crossed paths with other names like Georges Canguilhem, Paul Eluard, Frantz Fanon in the early 50s, and even with the invention of Cinema Direct in the early 60s. So his hospital, his experience, his laboratory became a place that sort of invited other experiments, other innovations. So again, the notion of the collective is very important, and institutional psychotherapy, it is not only to be connected to one name, but to many. And often, historically, collective work, it's very difficult to grasp, to represent, yet it's easily exploited, easily put to work. So that's what I think, that's why I think that the exhibition took that form, the form of something that cannot render one linear narrative. But on the other hand, I mean, we wanted to speak, if we wanted to say our root, we couldn't say our root without bringing next to it other institutional appropriations of the work produced by patients in hospitals, namely like psychopathological art, or the different appropriations other artists like Asger Jorn or Henri Michaud made out of the psychotic experiences. So there is no art root by itself unless it is in contrast, it is presented in dialogue with these other institutional appropriations.
Maybe to add just a note very quickly to what Carla said. Of course, Tosquelles was a foreigner. He was not French. He naturalized himself French, but his French was not. His written French was complicated. So lots of his books and lots of his texts were rewritten, were reread by other people. We know that the medical dissertation that Tosquelles defended in Paris in 1947 was rewritten by Jean Louis. For example, we know that Jérôme Milon and other people rewrite Tosquelles French. So he was a foreigner. He was not un grand homme, a big man and so on, and a big personality in terms of a corpus of work, written work. And the other thing, a very important one, is the peripheral situation of Saint-Alban. Of course, Tosquelles was a Lacanian, but he was not in an alliance with Lacan. He was not 2 times a week in Paris with Lacan, as other people in Laborde, Horry, and Guattari, and so on. So he was not, he didn't want to cultivate this relationship or this love relationship with the center, with Paris. He was in love with this sort of marginal situation, this locally situated periphery of Saint-Alban. So this periphery and this condition of foreigner were very important in this non-transmission of his work, as well as the collective dimension of his experimentations.
Wonderfully, I think that's explained. That explains a lot. And to go back to the US also, to the US context, I think, do you have anything to add? Do you think why here this personality is so little known in the US as well? And why do you think there is now so much attention given to that figure, like and why is it received with so much eager and enthusiasm? I think we have a question from someone who worked at Saint-Alban, and she's asking this question about that, like trying to explain understanding why there's so much enthusiasm for Saint-Alban's history and also for Tosquelles. And then I think we'll close the program. Thank you.
Yeah, I may respond to this. I really believe that Tosquelles walk on a tightrope when defending the institution, and not declaring the will to close it or get rid of it. So this is a debate that still riddles nowadays discussions on mental health politics. And in the history of the US, there is a clear moment in the 60s when Thomas Szasz promoted the deconstruction of the notion of illness, mental illness. At the same time, there is a process of the institutionalization. So the result is in the 80s that the neoliberal state has used this movement as an alibi to decrease the investment in mental health policies and services and beds in hospital. So I think for Kelly's it was always of opera, but of course he would always defend the institution as a place to be adapted and reinvented. He would not be afraid of being called a reactionary in that sense. Actually, in 1952, he was exchanging letters with Paul Balbé, the director of the psychiatric hospital in Sant Alban in the early 40s. And Paul Balbé somehow throw back to Tosquelles the possibility that he was not a revolutionary, that he was rather a reactionary, because of keeping the institution somehow relatively close in relationship with the with environment. And Tosquelles basically responded that he would prefer to be a reactionary in as much that in order to change something, you have to allow for something to stay there, to stay untouched. So I think that Tosquelles can have a great sort of it represents all these dilemmas, and because of that, it can have a great interest in US audiences.
Yes, very briefly, I would say that maybe if we are wondering, if we are trying to rediscover and to use Tosquelles nowadays, maybe it's because on the one hand, we are very interested, I think, in the 21st century in rediscover minoritarian legacies in a certain way, minoritarian legacies or not translated legacies. That's the reason why many people have been interested now in Tosquelles and his relationship to women psychiatrists and so on. So interested in what all this part of the main narrative that has not done has been non-existed and in a certain way. In another way, I think also that we really need in cultural practices, in art centers, in literary universities and faculties and so on, we need to feel that literature, culture, surrealism, art brut, or art practices are in some ways related to political practices. I think that if we have now this exhibition on Le Palais de Tokyo in Paris, is because these experiences on institutional psychotherapy may put together or may ask to think together these different experimentations in art field and in political also field. So I think we need a sort of urgency of this linking between culture and politics or art and politics. And maybe another question should be that, as Carla said, the urgent question in all this is the institution, the debates on the institution, both the mental institutions and the medical institutions, the hospitals themselves, which are in France, in Europe, at this moment, in a very difficult moment in which people are not inside the hospital. They are outside the hospital for obvious reasons. And on the other hand, we have also this parallel or this analogy between the psychiatric institutions and the institutions to the idea that we are making resonate this reflection on the institutions, and we are enlarging all these reflections on the institutions to the schools, to the university, to the politics, and so on. So we have this sort of enlarging comprehension of the institution, sort of political comprehension of the institutions, which is a very contemporary one. So I think that Tusquellas immediately resonates with this desire, our desire of transforming these alienated institutions in which we live, we work, and we are trained, and so on.
Yes, and troubled times we're traversing, and how institution can help us also lead these times. We have another wonderful question by one of our audience members, Sam Sami, but unfortunately we won't have time to handle it now. But I think this question between our aesthetics and psychiatry and the practice of Toscayes will be expanded and explained a little bit more in the next panel, especially with Camille Hopsis, who is going to really dive into the history of Saint-Alban and its political context. And also tomorrow, all the day is dedicated to the intersection between institutional psychotherapy and the arts. So come back for the next sessions. Thank you so much, Carles, and thank you so much, Joanna, for this wonderful first presentation, and you really start the day with a lot of inspiring information, and we're excited to have you with us to also hear in the chat. And so we see you in 20 minutes for the next panel called Saint-Alban-sur-les-Magnols, Psychiatric Hospital, a Laboratory of Political Resistance. And we'll hear from Camille Hopsis, Eric Fassin, Jean Khalfa, and Robert Jung. So I'll see you very soon, and thank you again to our co-creators of the exhibition.